Echoes in the Deep Brine, Chapter 5. The Cascade. The shriek of tortured metal died into a long, groaning sigh. It was the sound of a leviathan giving up the ghost. Jorin pressed his cheek against the cold, weeping rust of a support beam, his own breath a ragged counterpoint to the Arkology's death rattle. His lungs burned, every muscle screamed from the frantic climb, the desperate scramble through collapsing catwalks and panicked crowds. He was soaked to the bone, not with the clean recycled water of the Arium, but with the contaminated deluge from below. His crisp directorate uniform, a symbol of his authority and detachment, was a ruined, clinging shroud of dark gray fabric. Lost. His datapad, his case files, his biometric scanner, all lost to the flood. He was an analyst without data, a surgeon without a scalpel. Below them, through the corroded mesh of the service tunnel's floor, was a vision of chaos. The vast cylindrical chamber that housed Water Reclamation Unit GAMMA7 was a chasm of churning gray water and screaming steam. A titanic rupture had split the tank's flank, a wound that vomited a thick, pearlescent mist into the air, obscuring the far side of the massive cavern. Emergency lights flashed in strobing, impotent rhythm, their red and white beams swallowed by the rolling fog. "We're safe here. For now." Brekker's voice was a low rumble beside him, a block of solid reality in the churning madness. The big enforcer hadn't even broken a sweat, his movements as economical and sure as the pistons in a reclamation pump. He methodically checked the seals on the tunnel hatch they'd squeezed through, his augmented hand clicking softly as he tested the maglock. Tunnel leads back toward the mid-bellows spine. Should be above the floodline. Jorin could only nod, his gaze fixed on the spectacle below. His mind, desperate for purchase, began to triage the scene with academic coldness. It was a defense mechanism, the only one he had left. "Structural failure," he murmured, the words tasting like ozone and fungus. The tremors Otho mentioned must have stressed a pre-existing fissure. The pressure differential would do the rest. That mist, it's just superheated water vapor, steam.
Brekker moved to the grate, his heavy boots making no sound. He stared down, his expression unreadable in the gloom. Sir, with respect, steam rises, it dissipates. This stuff," he gestured with his chin, "it's heavy, it's pooling." Jorin forced himself to look closer, to truly see. Brekker was right. The mist wasn't behaving like steam. It billowed from the breach in thick, heavy plumes, then rolled downward, clinging to surfaces like a living thing. It filled the lower portions of the chamber, a dense, shimmering blanket of aerosolized brine. And in the intermittent flashes of the emergency strodes, Jorin saw it, a faint, internal luminescence. The mist wasn't just reflecting the light, it was glittering with its own millions of tiny phosphorescent points, like a galaxy of sickly green stars. It was beautiful, in the way a venomous jellyfish is beautiful. "It's the bioluminescent algae," Jorin countered, his own logic sounding thin and reedy. "From the raw intake water, the heat aerosolized the spores. It's a known phenomenon, an anomaly, but explainable." "It's not just algae, Jorin," said Brekker, his use of the first name a subtle breach of protocol that spoke volumes about their current situation. "Look at it. It hangs in the air, like dust, like pollen." The word hung in the humid air between them. Pollen. Spores. Vectors. Then the sound began to filter up through the groaning of the broken tank. It was the chant, the same one from the refinery, the same one he'd heard whispered on comms intercepts, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. The sea sleeps, and we are the dream. But it was different now. The unified melodic precision was gone. The chorus was fractured, broken, and woven into it was a new sound, a wet, percussive, tearing noise. A cough, a deep, hacking cough that sounded like it was ripping a lung out by the root. Then another, and another. Soon it was a chorus of its own, a cacophony of desperate, agonizing expectoration that punctuated the chanting. A man's voice, trying to hold the melodic line of the chant, dissolved into a fit of hacking. A woman's humming note became a choked, wet gasp. The sound echoed off the vast chamber walls, a symphony of plague. Jorin felt the blood drain from his face, his scientific detachment shattered like polymer glass under a sledgehammer.
They're coughing, he whispered, the words a surrender. The lung rot's been bad this cycle, Brekker said, his voice tight. But never like this, never this fast. That isn't lung rot, Jorin said, his voice hollow. He gripped the rusted beam, his knuckles white. The pieces were laid out before him, a mosaic of absolute horror. The breach, the contaminated water, the aerosolized mist shimmering with organic light, the chanting, the coughing. 1 + 1 + 1. It wasn't a mimetic contagion spread by proximity and psychological weakness. Not anymore. He had been so focused on the software of belief, he'd ignored the possibility that it could overwrite the hardware of biology. He'd pushed, he'd quarantined, he'd treated them like specimens in a jar, and in his arrogance, he had agitated the culture. He had forced it to mutate, to evolve, to find a new, more efficient delivery system. The spores weren't a byproduct of the algae. They were the plague, and now they were in the air. He felt a sudden phantom tickle in his own throat, a reflexive need to clear it. He swallowed hard, the metallic tang of the recycled air thick on his tongue. Was it real, or was it the power of suggestion, the first symptom of a cognitive virus? No, he breathed. It was an argument with reality itself, a plea. It can't be airborne. Beliefs don't become airborne. As if in answer, a single clear, wet cough echoed up from the mist-choked darkness below. It cut through the groaning metal and the fractured chanting, sharp and final. A full stop at the end of a sentence he could no longer deny reading. Brekker looked at him, his face a mask of grim understanding. The ventilation shafts, sir, they all feed from these reclamation hubs. The bellows, the aerium, everywhere. The structured world of tiered districts, of sterile air and clean water, of dry feet and damp skins, dissolved in that single statement. There were no more safe levels, no more quarantines. The breach hadn't just flooded a few sectors, it had just flooded the entire world. The air in Otho Valerius's office was a meticulously crafted lie. It smelled of nothing, which was the ultimate luxury in Haven. No brine, no rust, no fungal damp. Just the sterile ozonic tang of high-efficiency recyclers humming a tune of absolute control. Through the vast polymer glass wall, a projected sky dome displayed a serene, cloudless azure, a color no living soul in the Arkology had seen for real. It was a perfect, silent, unassailable world. On his desk of polished, reclaimed steel, a datapad glowed with a far less perfect reality. Otho traced the redacted lines of the incident report with a manicured finger, his jaw tight. The official summary was clean, clinical. Mass psychogenic incident, Reclamation Plant 7 Gamma. It spoke of a riot, a containment failure, and erratic subject behavior. It did not use words like plague or chanting or unison. The directorate's language scrubbers had done their job. The raw data, however, painted a picture of pure chaos, a failure not of the system, but of the man he had sent to enforce it. Jorin Vosk. The name soured the perfect air in his mouth. A brilliant mind, yes, but brittle, damaged. Otho had thought Vosk's past trauma would make him ruthlessly efficient, a scalpel to excise the tumor of faith. Instead, the man had become a sledgehammer, cracking the very foundation he was meant to stabilize. He had let hysteria fester into a full-blown riot. He had lost control. And in Haven, control was the only currency with any real value. A soft chime announced a presence at his door. "Enter," Otho said, his voice as cool and flat as the steel desk. The door slid open with a whisper of pneumatics. His senior aide, Ilara, stepped inside. Her dark directorate uniform was immaculate, her hair pulled back into a severe knot, but a faint sheen of sweat glistened on her temple. It was an offensive, bellows-level sign of weakness. She held her own datapad like a shield. "Director Valerius," she began, her voice tight. "The situation at Reclamation 7 has escalated. We have a confirmed structural failure. The main tank has been breached." Otho didn't look up from his own report. The fury that had been simmering within him now cooled into something harder, something useful. Ice. "It's a riot, Ilara. A predictable consequence when dampskins are exposed to an industrial neurotoxin and one man fails to properly enforce mental hygiene protocols. That is the record. See that it is reflected in all outbound communiques." "Sir, the flood," she stammered. It's not just water. The preliminary sensor readings from the circulation ducts are anomalous. The spore count—" "The spore count is irrelevant," Otho cut her off, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes were devoid of warmth. "The bellows is a petri dish on its best day. Contamination is its natural state." He leaned forward, tapping a sequence on his desk console. A soft, deep thrum resonated through the floor, barely perceptible. Far below, Otho pictured kilometers of groaning steel as massive quarantine blast doors sealed the primary transit corridors between the bellows and the Arium's lower access levels. A problem neatly boxed in. "I've initiated a hard lockdown of sectors Beta through Theta," he stated. "Nothing gets in or out. Let the infection burn itself out. The dampskins will relearn the value of order through its absence." Ilara took a half-step closer, her professional composure cracking. "Sir, with all due respect, the atmospheric systems, the water reclamation cycle, it's all interconnected. If the spores are airborne, if they've entered the primary circulation vents—" Otho rose from his chair. "Ha!" It was a dry, rasping sound, utterly devoid of humor. He walked to the vast window, the false blue sky reflecting in his polished shoes. Ilara, how long have you served in the area?
7 years, sir.
And in 7 years, have you ever once tasted the brine on the air? Have you ever had to check your boots for fungal blooms? Have you ever suffered from metal hum madness? He gestured to the pristine silent space around them. This is not the bellows. This is a fortress. Our atmospheric scrubbers operate on a molecular level. They were designed to filter out weaponized particulates, pre-Cascade viral strains, radioactive isotopes. They can scrub prions from recycled air. He turned to face her, a condescending smile touching his lips. You are worried about a little mold from a broken toilet downstairs? It is a biological and sociological impossibility for their filth to reach us here. His certainty was absolute, a faith more powerful than any a grubby cultist could muster. He believed in the system, in the cold, hard math of pressure gradients and filtration polymers and social stratification. The chaos below wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity, an object lesson. It was proof that the Directorate's rigid control, its philosophy of structured survivalism, was not cruel but necessary. The weak, the susceptible, the emotional, they would be purged. The system would emerge stronger, cleaner, and so would he. He returned to his desk, his mind moving past the immediate crisis and on to the next, more crucial phase, narrative management. A disaster of this magnitude needed a face, a villain, a focal point for the city's fear and anger. It couldn't be a faceless neurotoxin or a failing pump. It needed to be a deliberate act. He swiped his data pad, the filtered report vanishing to be replaced by a personnel file. Jorin Vask's face stared back at him, haggard, haunted, the perfect image of a man unraveled, a rogue element, a believer who had lost his own faith and in his madness decided to inflict a new one upon the city. It was perfect. Jorin was down there, in the heart of the chaos he had failed to contain, untouchable, unaccountable, the ideal scapegoat. Ilara, Otho said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial calm. The fury was gone, replaced by a chilling, righteous clarity. Cancel my afternoon appointments. I want you to draft a citywide emergency broadcast. Sir, what should it say?
Otho looked from Jorin's picture to the flawless blue sky and back again. He felt a sense of profound purpose settle over him. He was not just containing a disaster, he was authoring the history of it. He was restoring order. Declare a state of emergency, effective immediately, he commanded, his voice ringing with the finality of an execution order. And cite the cause. We have been attacked. Inform the populace that the contagion spreading through the bellows is not an accident. It is a targeted act of bioterrorism, orchestrated by the rogue forensic theologian Jorin Vask. The air was thick enough to chew. Jorin had always thought of the bellows atmosphere as a tangible thing, a wet, heavy blanket of recycled oxygen, rust, and brine. Now it was something more, something active. It shimmered. Under the sickly green glow of the fungal lamps lining the catwalks, the air glittered with a fine, almost invisible particulate, like diamond dust caught in a sunbeam that would never reach this far down. But there was no sunbeam. There was only the haze. Keep moving. Brekker's voice was a low rumble beside him, a solid point in a world dissolving into chaos. The enforcer moved with a coiled economy, his augmented frame a dark, dense shape cutting through the panicked throngs. He'd torn the hydrocorpus insignia from his own fatigues, leaving a dark rectangle of cleaner fabric over his heart, a ghost of an allegiance. Jorin, by contrast, felt stripped bare. His directorate uniform, now stained with grime and the foul water from the flood, was a mockery of the authority he no longer possessed. The briefcase, his entire armory of data slates, neuroanalyzers, and faith metrics was gone, swallowed by the deluge. He was just a man in ruined clothes, running. A damp skin. No, less than that. An ungrounded. They pushed through a marketplace section near Hub 7. The usual cacophony of vendors hawking nutrient paste and scavenged tech was muted, replaced by a low hum of anxiety. People huddled in small groups, casting fearful glances at the vents in the ceiling, where the shimmering mist seemed thickest. A rhythmic, wet cough echoed through the cavernous space, a percussive counterpoint to the ever-present groaning of stressed metal and the drip, drip, drip of condensation.
"It's the spores," Jorin murmured, his voice hoarse. He didn't need a particulate counter to know. He had theorized this mutation, scribbled it in a notebook as a worst-case scenario, an airborne vector. He had treated it as an intellectual exercise. Now he was breathing his failure. From the reclamation tank. It's in the air circulators. It's everywhere. Which means we don't have much time before everyone down here is what? Brekker asked, his eyes scanning the crowd, his hand never far from the heavy pistol strapped to his thigh. Before everyone was singing, Jorin thought. But that wasn't right anymore. Something had changed. The song had deepened its pitch. He watched a man leaning against a corroded container wall, his body racked by a coughing fit. The man's wife held his arm, her face a mask of terror. It was a common sight. Lung rot was a constant fear in the bellows. But this was different. As the man doubled over, gasping for air, Jorin saw it. On the pale, slick skin of the man's neck, just below his ear, a pattern bloomed. It wasn't a rash. It was a light, a faint, phosphorescent tracery of sickly blue-green, like a detail from a forgotten circuit board or the veins on a strange leaf. It pulsed once, in time with the man's ragged breath, then faded slightly, remaining as a delicate, alien tattoo. Jorin stopped dead. The flow of the crowd pushed against him like a current. "What is it?" Brekker grabbed his arm. "Jorin, don't freeze up. Move." The theologian couldn't speak. He could only point, his finger trembling. His entire life's work, his structured, rational understanding of belief as a purely cognitive phenomenon, was fracturing like polymer glass under a hammer blow. He had categorized faith into neat boxes, messianic complexes, mimetic contagions, shared psychoses, diseases of the mind. This was a disease of the flesh. Brekker followed his gaze. He saw the glowing pattern on the coughing man's neck. The enforcer's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He said nothing, but his grip on Jorin's arm became steel. "We need to go. Now," Brekker said, his voice flat with a dawning horror that was far more terrifying than any panic.
But now that Jorin had seen it, he saw it everywhere. A vendor sorting through a bin of kelp noodles absent-mindedly scratched her forearm, and for a fleeting moment a filigree of light, like glowing frost, bloomed and vanished under her fingernails. A child, crying in her father's arms, had a faint, shimmering web of lines spreading from the corner of her eye, glistening like a tear made of starlight. It wasn't just chanting anymore. The lullaby had become a physical scripture written onto their very cells. The air grew heavier. The shimmering haze seemed to coalesce around those who were coughing, clinging to them. The sound wasn't just coughing now. A low, resonant hum began to rise from the crowd, not a chant, not yet, but the precursor to one, a collective tuning of vocal cords. A few people stopped moving, their heads cocked to one side as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. Then the panic began. A woman shrieked, pointing at her own hands. On her palms, bright turquoise spirals were pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. She tried to wipe them off, her screams turning to sobs as the light persisted, glowing through her frantic fingers. Her fear was the spark. The crowd, already primed with anxiety, ignited. "Infected!" someone yelled. "Plague spreader!" The accusation wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but it didn't need to be. The mob turned on itself. People scrambled away from anyone who coughed, from anyone who stumbled. A shove became a stampede. The fragile, desperate civility of the bellows evaporated in an instant. The air filled with shouts, the crash of overturned market stalls, and the wet thuds of bodies hitting the permacrete floor. Brekker was a rock in the torrent. "Jorin!" he barked, yanking him out of his horrified trance. "Move or we die here!" Jorin stumbled, his analytical mind utterly useless, replaced by a primal animal terror. This was his work, his quarantine, his aggressive deprogramming. His disharmonious song had not contained the crows. It had forced its god to change its tune. He had tried to cure a psychological contagion by treating it like a pathogen, and in his arrogance he had turned it into a real one. The patterns on their skin, they weren't random. They were structured, intricate, like coral, like the carvings he'd seen in the refinery.
He felt the violent cough build in his own chest, and for a terrifying second he was certain he would look down and see his own hands glowing with the divine sickness. He suppressed it, the effort making his eyes water. The air burned in his lungs. Ozone, rust, and something else. Something sweet and fungal. The song of the brine. Brekker shoved him down a narrow side passage, a cramped maintenance corridor slick with algae. The roar of the panicked mob was a physical pressure behind them. Ahead, the corridor was dark, lit only by a single flickering LED that cast their shadows long and distorted. "We can't stay in the main thoroughfares," Brekker gasped, leaning against the dripping wall for a second. "The hygiene squads, they won't be asking questions anymore. They'll just purge." Jorin could only nod, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He had believed in systems, in order, in the predictable pathology of the human psyche. He looked back toward the marketplace, where the green and blue lights of the infection bloomed and pulsed in the chaos like fallen constellations. The system had failed. Order was a lie, and the disease was more beautiful and terrifying than he had ever imagined. The air in Otho Valerius's office was a lie. It was clean, so clinically scrubbed of the Arkology's persistent brine and fungal damp that it had no smell at all, only a faint ozonic tang that spoke of expensive, perfectly functioning technology. It was the scent of control. Outside the polymer glass wall, the sky dome projector painted a flawless canvas of cerulean blue, a shade no one under the age of 70 had ever seen in person. It was a beautiful, calculated falsehood. Otho stood before a holographic display that floated above his desk of polished, reclaimed steel. The display showed none of the dome's serenity. It was a tactical grid of the bellows, a chaotic tapestry of red and amber alerts. Section after section was flashing, indicating containment breaches and structural warnings. Grainy pick feed showed flooded catwalks, water thick as soup gushing from ruptured conduits. The citywide alarms, a distant, muffled groaning even here in the insulated heart of the areum, were a soundtrack to the failure. His failure. No, not his, Vask's.
Jorin Vask.
The name was a shard of glass in his mind. His finest instrument, the scalpel he used to excise the cancers of faith from the body of Haven, had turned into a sledgehammer, shattering the very system it was meant to protect. Otho's jaw was a knot of petrified muscle. He had seen the initial reports from the refinery, the biomechanical shrine, the mutated flesh, a cognitive virus, Vask had called it. Otho had approved the quarantine, the brutal, necessary isolation. But Jorin, in his hubristic pursuit, had pushed too hard. He had treated the chorus like a simple delusion, and in doing so had provoked the disease into a pandemic. Now the water reclamation systems were compromised. The infection was no longer a matter of proximity. It was in the very air, the very water. A systemic crisis born from a single man's arrogance. Structured survivalism is not a theory, Vask. It is a law, and you have broken it. His focus was absolute. Locate the rogue theologian, contain him, and make an example of him. The populace needed to see that the system corrected its flaws. It was the only way to restore faith in the directorate, to quell the rising tide of despair that was the true contagion. A soft, respectful chime echoed in the silent office. "Enter," Otho said, not turning from the display. The door slid open with a quiet hiss. A young woman in the gray uniform of an environmental systems technician stood in the doorway, her posture ramrod straight, holding a data slate as if it were a shield. She was a damp skin, elevated by aptitude tests, but never truly belonging here, in the dry. Her face was pale, her dark hair slicked back with a nervous sheen of moisture that the humidifiers of the office had not yet had time to bake away. "Director Valerius, Tech Rihanna, ESY's monitoring. Apologies for the intrusion." "Report," Otho commanded. His eyes remained fixed on the hologram, tracing the path of a Hydrocorpus enforcer squad moving through a flooded corridor. "Sir, we're tracking anomalous pressure readings across the entire Arkology ventilation network." Rihanna stepped forward, placing her slate on the edge of Otho's desk. A smaller secondary hologram bloomed from it, showing a schematic of Haven's circulatory system of ducts and vents.
Otho gave it a cursory glance. "We have 36 sectors under hard lockdown, Tech. The system is compensating for the sealed bulkheads. Expect anomalies. This is a waste of my time."
"With respect, Director, this isn't compensation." Her voice gained a sliver of confidence, the conviction of pure data. "This is inverted. Look." She tapped the slate, and lines of code streamed beside the schematic. "The pressure differential regulators are in a cascade failure. The system is registering a pressure drop in the aerium circulation loops, while simultaneously showing a significant pressure increase in the sealed sections of the bellows, specifically around the compromised Water Reclamation Unit." Otho finally turned his head, his gray eyes narrowing. He was a man of systems, and a system behaving illogically was an offense. "Explain that in plainer language, Tech." "It's flowing the wrong way, sir," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "Air should be forced out of sealed sections to prevent contaminant spread. But this is like something is breathing, like a massive lung is inhaling from the aerium and exhaling into the bellows, pressurizing the contaminated zones. It's physically impossible according to the system specs." A cold flicker of irritation went through Otho. A breathing archaeology. It sounded like the mystical rust rot the chorus of the Brine would spout. It was precisely the kind of existential contagion he worked to eradicate. "It's not impossible, Tech Rihanna.
It's a sensor malfunction. The flooding in the bellows is causing electrical bleed and false positives. The spores, the humidity, they're corroding the delicate instrumentation. Your model is compromised. The data is noise. Sir, these are hardened, redundant sensors. The probability of simultaneous, system-wide failure presenting a coherent inverse pattern is statistically zero, she countered, her bravery faltering under his cold gaze.
Statistics are a luxury we no longer have. Otho turned his back on her completely, his attention returning to the tactical grid. He magnified a sector, watching the tiny blue icons of Brekker Hearn's unit converge on a transit hub. The physical containment of the flood is holding. The infection is spreading through panic, through despair. The root cause is a human vector, not a phantom in the vents. My priority is Jorin Vask. He is the disease. The rest is just symptoms. He gestured dismissively toward the door without looking. Recalibrate your models. Submit a report on sensor integrity. Do not bother me with ghost stories again. The silence that followed was heavy with her defeat. Yes, Director. The words were barely a whisper. The door hissed open, then closed, leaving Otho once more in the sterile solitude of his authority. He felt a surge of righteous certainty. This was the problem with specialists. They couldn't see the whole system. They saw faulty regulators, not a city losing its mind. They saw data, not despair. Only he had the perspective, the will to see the crisis for what it was and to perform the necessary ruthless surgery. He refocused on the map, his mind already formulating the broadcast he would make. He would name Jorin Vask. He would declare him a terrorist, a rogue element who had weaponized a fringe belief system. He would turn the city's fear into a focused, righteous hunt. It was clean. It was logical. It was control. The perfect recycled air in the room suddenly felt thick, cloying. Otho tugged at the stiff, high collar of his directorate uniform. A persistent, nagging itch had started on his left wrist, right under the cufflink. An irritation, probably a reaction to the fabric, a consequence of the stress. He unconsciously brought his right hand over, scratching at the spot through the fine material of his sleeve, his eyes never leaving the map where he was plotting the capture of the man who had brought this ruin upon them all. He scratched again, harder this time, a mindless, repetitive motion. He didn't bother to roll up the sleeve. There was nothing to see. It was just an itch, a minor, insignificant anomaly in a system that was, otherwise, he was certain, perfectly under his control.
The sound hit them first. Not a single noise, but a cohesive wall of it, a physical pressure against the eardrums. It was the sound of 1,000 people screaming, their individual terror compressed by concrete and rusted steel into a single resonant roar of pure panic. Jorin and Brekker skidded to a halt at the junction, the corridor opening into the cavernous maw of the Bellows Central Transit Station. Water, ankle-deep and murky with greenish algal bloom, lapped at their boots. The air was thick with the smells of ozone from shorting circuits, the coppery tang of fear sweat, and the now familiar, sickly sweet scent of the spores. It coated the back of the throat, a taste of rot and ruin. Rust rot, Brekker breathed, his augmented hand instinctively clenching into a fist. The whole sector's trying to punch through to the mid-levels. Jorin's eyes struggled to process the scene. The station, usually a place of orderly cues and droning PA announcements, was a living organism of chaos. A tide of human bodies surged against the magnetically sealed lift gates that led to the drier, safer levels above.
They clawed at the polymer glass, their faces contorted masks of desperation. Above them, on a narrow catwalk, a handful of Directorate enforcers in black composite armor stood, their forms silhouetted against the flickering white emergency LEDs. They were overwhelmed, reduced from agents of control to terrified men with pulse rifles. Jorin's mind, a finely tuned instrument for pattern recognition, tried to find the logic, the system within the chaos. He saw it not as a mob, but as a fluid dynamic problem. There were currents, eddies, pressure points. It was a pathological response, a system in catastrophic failure. And a system, he believed, could still be influenced. His gaze swept the pandemonium and locked onto a target. Across the seething plaza, bolted to the wall beside the sealed lifts, was the Directorate Security comms panel. Its status light was blinking a steady, hopeful green. "The panel," Jorin said, his voice tight, almost drowned out by the din. He pointed, his hand shaking slightly. "The comms panel, it's a secure line, direct link to the Arium command hub. If I can get to it, I can reach Otho." Brekker turned to him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Reach him? Jorin, are you seeing this?"
I can tell him about the water reclamation tank, the airborne spore vector, the filtration systems in the Arium. They might not be rated for this kind of biological agent. We can get ahead of it, isolate the ventilation sectors, lock down the water supplies up there, before—" His voice trailed off. "Before it's too late." The words tasted like ash. It was already too late. He knew it. But to admit it was to accept the totality of his failure. It was a truth he was not yet capable of metabolizing. Brekker grabbed Jorin's shoulder, forcing him to meet his gaze. "Listen to me. That's not a crowd. That's a grinder. You take one step into that, you're not a person anymore. You're just meat. They'll tear you apart, or they'll crush you against that gate until your ribs crack. I've seen it before." "We have to try." Jorin's voice cracked, bordering on a shout. "Every second we waste here, the infection spreads. This isn't just the bellows anymore, Brekker. This is the whole Arkology. This is extinction." The word hung in the humid air between them, stark and absolute. Jorin pulled away from Brekker's grip, his face a taut canvas of guilt and frantic determination. He saw the path, a desperate, suicidal line through the chaos. Along the right wall, using the maintenance conduits for cover, then a 20-meter dash across an open space where the crowd was slightly less dense. It was a fool's gambit. It was the only gambit he had left. A calculated risk, he told himself, the old familiar language of his profession, a comforting lie. Acceptable losses for a strategic objective. He took a step, and the world lurched. A deep, grinding groan echoed from the foundations of the station, the sound of titanic metal plates shifting under unbearable stress. For a horrifying second, the floor vibrated violently. A high-pressure water main running along the ceiling, already weeping from a dozen rusted seams, catastrophically ruptured. A torrent of contaminated spore-heavy water crashed down into the center of the crowd. The roar of panic amplified tenfold. People slipped in the sudden deluge, vanishing under the trampling feet of the mob. The surge of bodies became a tidal wave. Up on the catwalk, one of the guards lost his footing, his scream cut short as he was swept over the edge and into the churning mass below. "Fall back! Fire suppression rounds! Disperse them!" an officer screamed, his voice thin and reedy over the chaos. The crack, crack, crack of pulse rifles echoed. Not the lethal whine of focused energy, but the dull thud of suppression charges. Blue-white flashes lit up the station, each one followed by a concussive boom that did nothing to deter the crowd. It was like throwing stones at an avalanche. A stray shot ricocheted off a steel girder, exploding in a shower of sparks just meters from Jorin's head. He flinched back,
the heat of it kissing his cheek. Brekker hauled him backward, pulling him into the relative shelter of the corridor's entrance. I said, "No! It's over! There's no warning them, Jorin! There's no one left to warn!" Jorin fought against him, his movements frantic. "Let go of me! I can still—" He stopped. His eyes, scanning the crowd for another path, another chance, had caught something. In the midst of the screaming, the crushing, the dying, there were pockets of calm. People standing still, untouched by the surge, their bodies swaying gently. A woman, her face streaked with grime, stood with her head tilted back, a beatific smile on her lips as the filthy water rained down on her. A man, his arm clearly broken and bent at an unnatural angle, was not screaming in pain, but humming, a low, resonant thrum that Jorin could feel in his teeth. Their eyes were filmed over with a milky, bioluminescent sheen, glowing with a soft, internal blue light. They weren't fighting the chaos. They were embracing it. The plague wasn't just in the water or the air, it was in the crowd itself, a virus of the mind spreading faster than any physical contagion. The structured world Jorin believed in, the one built on predictable systems and rational responses, dissolved into a bloody, incomprehensible nightmare. These people weren't just panicked, they were being transformed. The despair and terror the guards were creating with their suppression fire, it wasn't dispersing them, it was feeding the entity. It was making more hosts. He had thought he could analyze the disease from a distance, but he was standing in the heart of the tumor. The comms panel across the station flickered, its green light swallowed by the roiling darkness of the mob. It wasn't a beacon of hope. It was a tombstone, marking the death of a world that made sense.
Jorin. Brekker's voice was low, urgent. He shook him again, harder this time. Jorin, snap out of it. We have to move, now. Jorin looked at the former enforcer, his own face a reflection in Brekker's polished cybernetic eye. He saw a man stripped bare. No title, no authority. His uniform was torn and stained, his briefcase full of data slates lost to the floodwaters. All the tools of his intellect, all the systems of his belief were gone. He was no longer a forensic theologian. He was just a man trapped in a tomb of his own making. His shoulders slumped. The determined hope that had propelled him this far evaporated, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. "There's no way through," he said, the words a surrender. "There's no way up." "No," Brekker agreed, his gaze scanning the corridors behind them, back into the drowning heart of the bellows. "There's only down, or sideways. Come on." He pulled Jorin away from the gates of chaos, away from the last vestiges of a dying order, and dragged him back into the labyrinth. The roar of the station faded behind them, replaced by the familiar, intimate sounds of groaning metal and the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the Arkology weeping. The iron grill slammed shut with a percussive clang that echoed the finality of a cell door. Jorin recoiled, his hand slapping against the wet, corroded metal. Beyond the bars, the transit station concourse was a maelstrom of raw panic. Emergency strobes painted the chaos in stuttering flashes of blood red and sterile white. A tide of screaming people surged against the barricade, their faces contorted masks of terror, their hands reaching through the bars like the damned. The air, thick with the coppery tang of fear and ozone, was punctuated by the rhythmic, inhuman blare of the Arkology-wide alarm. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a funeral dirge. "Move!" Brekker's voice was a low growl, his large hand clamping onto the shoulder of Jorin's ruined directorate jacket and hauling him backward. They stumbled away from the grill, Brekker's augmented arm a solid anchor in the swirling current of desperation. He shoved Jorin into a narrow fissure between a rusted ventilation unit and the weeping concrete wall of a nutrient-paced dispensary.
The alley reeked of stagnant water, spoiled kelp, and something acridly chemical, a smell that scraped the back of Jorin's throat.
Water, slick with an oily, faintly glowing sheen, pooled around their ankles. From the main causeway, the sounds were clearer, sharper, and infinitely more terrible. The wet slap of running feet, the splintering crash of a storefront, and then a series of sharp, popping sounds. Not weapon fire, something else, something organic and final. Jorin's mind, a tool honed for analysis and pattern recognition, supplied the answer with cold, clinical horror: summary executions. The mental hygiene squads were no longer containing, they were cleansing. The despair they were sowing would be a fertile field for the very plague they sought to eradicate. "My plague," a voice whispered in the back of his skull. "It's over," Jorin breathed, the words fogging in the frigid, damp air. He leaned his head back against the slimy wall, the fight draining out of him. The orderly progression of steps, contain, animize, deprogram, had dissolved into this screaming, drowning bedlam. The system has collapsed. The primary transit hub is compromised. There's no way to the Arium, no way to warn them. "Warn them of what?" Brekker retorted, his voice tight with a pragmatism that bordered on cruelty. He was peering around the edge of the alley, his posture low, a predator assessing a chaotic hunting ground. "That the plague is airborne? That the water is poison? Look at them, they know." He gestured with his head toward the concourse. "The dry feet in the Arium are probably seeing it on their own air scrubbers by now. The vents connect everything. The whole damn Arkology is one big lung, Jorin, and it's infected." Jorin closed his eyes. The briefcase with his data pad, his analytical tools, his recorded interviews with the refinery workers, all lost in the flood. The symbols of his authority, his very identity, washed away. He was just another damp skin now, another piece of flotsam in the deluge. "Then what do we do? We're cut off. Otho!" He trailed off, the name a knot of betrayal in his throat. Otho had sent him down here. He had known the risks. Had he known this would happen?
"Forget Otho, forget the Arium," Brekker grunted, turning back to face him fully. The sickly green glow from a patch of bioluminescent fungus on a nearby pipe carved deep shadows into his face. "Official channels are death traps. Every public way is either flooded or a kill zone for the hygiene squads. We try to go up the main lifts, we either get shot or we get infected." "So that's it. We stay down here and wait to—" Jorin couldn't finish the sentence. Wait to hear the song? Wait for the coral-like patterns to bloom on his own skin? "No." Brekker's gaze was intense. "We don't wait. We go sideways." Jorin stared at him, uncomprehending. "Sideways? What does that even mean?" Brekker took a deep breath, the sound a low hiss in the claustrophobic space. "Before Hydrocorpus scrubbed my file and made me their good little enforcer, my specialty was asset recovery. Back when they were still dredging pre-Cascade hardware from the stillness. They have redundancies, ghost systems, things that aren't on any official schematic because they break about a dozen directorate protocols." Jorin felt a spike of his old professional indignation. "Undocumented workarounds, black market infrastructure. It's unreliable, unsecure. The ungrounded use routes like that. They're death traps." "The world you knew is the death trap now," Brekker snapped, his patience fraying. "Listen to me. There's a comms relay, an old one, hardwired. It's in the M3 maintenance spine, about 6 levels down from here. It's a direct backdoor into the Arium's core comms network, built for Hydrocorpus executives to use if the Directorate ever tried to lock them out. It bypasses the public net entirely. 6 levels down, deeper into the bellows, deeper into the flood, the infection. The idea was madness. It violated every tenet of his training, his entire worldview, which was built on the sanctity of documented, authorized systems. To use such a thing was to embrace the very chaos he was meant to fight. Even if it exists, Jorin argued, his voice thin, the maintenance spines are unmonitored. They're not structurally sound, full of lung rot spores, metal hum pockets.
And full of people who don't have Directorate clearance, Brekker finished for him, a grim understanding in his eyes. Drifters, ungrounded, maybe even some of the chorus. Yes, it's dangerous, but it's a focused danger, a danger we can maybe navigate. Out here, he gestured vaguely to the cacophony beyond the alley, out here is just random, screaming death. Here we drown. Down there, we might find a way to breathe. The logic was undeniable, a cold, sharp piece of shrapnel lodging itself in Jorin's collapsing ideology. All his life he had believed in the system. He had diagnosed faiths as system errors, social viruses that could be quarantined and purged. Now the system itself was the virus, and the only path forward was an act of heresy against it. He thought of his family, of the cool, rational confidence with which he'd explained to his superiors that the last cult was a manageable psychological phenomenon, right up until the moment it wasn't. He had followed the procedures then, too. He had trusted the system. His gaze fell to the viscous water swirling around his boots. In its murky depths, a greenish spore pulsed with a soft internal light before being swept away by the current. It looked alive, conscious. He was out of options. His way had failed, catastrophically. The desperation that had threatened to drown him moments ago began to recede, replaced by something colder, harder, a grim, terrifying resolve. If the world of rules was gone, then he would have to learn to survive in the world of exceptions. Jorin pushed himself off the wall, his posture straightening. The ruin of his uniform hung on him like a shroud, but his eyes, for the first time in hours, were clear and focused. The air in Otho Valerius's office was a lie, a beautiful, meticulously crafted lie. Filtered to surgical sterility, it carried none of the bellows' signature scents. No wet rust, no ozone, no fungal tang. Here in the Arium, high above the groaning heart of Haven, the air was an odorless assertion of control. Above, the sky dome projected a flawless, cloudless cerulean day, another falsehood designed to ward off the psychological pressure of the perpetual gray storms that truly raged outside.
On the obsidian polymer glass of his desk, the faces of the Haven Authority Directorate floated like anxious ghosts. Director Lynn's image was tight with stress, her lips a thin line. Engineer Primus Kalin looked haggard, his feed flickering with signal bleed from the overwhelmed network. Otho alone was a pillar of calm. He stood, his posture immaculate, his voice a scalpel dissecting the chaos. "The situation is critical, but it is not complex," he stated, his gaze sweeping across the holographic displays. The structural failure at Reclamation Tank 7 was a direct result of the seismic instability, a tragic but predictable system stress. The pandemic, however, is not. He let the word hang in the silent, sterile air. This is not an outbreak.
This is an attack, a deliberate act of bioterrorism perpetrated by a single compromised asset. Otho steepled his fingers, a gesture of thoughtful authority he had practiced to perfection. Forensic theologian Jorin Vask, in his obsessive pursuit of the cult known as the Chorus of the Brine, has breached every protocol of mental hygiene. He did not contain the mimetic contagion. He cultivated it, weaponized it. Director Lin leaned forward, her image shimmering. Weaponized it, Otho? How? The reports from the refinery described biomechanical fusion, things that defy physics. Precisely, Otho said, his voice smooth as polished steel. Vask's file is replete with notations on existential contagion. He theorized that certain belief structures could overwrite physical laws on a quantum level if the psychic pressure was sufficient. We dismissed it as academic vanity. He made a gesture of dismissal with his right hand, a flick of the wrist. It appears, in his madness, he decided to test his hypothesis. He engineered a catalyst, a more aggressive strain of the chorus's faith, and introduced it into the refinery. The subsequent panic, the tremors, the water breach, they created the perfect storm for citywide dissemination. He has turned our home into his personal laboratory. It was a masterful narrative. It was clean, simple, and it gave them a target, a monster to blame. He could see the relief washing over the other directors' faces. A single rogue agent was a problem they could solve. A collapsing reality was not.
As he spoke his final damning sentence, he brought his hand down to rest on the cool surface of the desk. In the pristine, simulated daylight of his office, a tiny point of light on the back of that hand caught his eye. It was no bigger than a grain of salt, a fleck of phosphorescence against his pale skin, an errant mote of dust, perhaps, caught in the beam of the projector. He ignored it, continuing his address. Our course of action is therefore clear. We declare a state of absolute emergency. We brand Jorin Vask a terrorist. His face and designation will be broadcast on every public screen. We will offer a substantial kilocal bounty for his capture, dead or alive. We must sever the head of this snake before his poison corrupts the entire Arkology. Kalen nodded grimly. And the infected, Otho, the mental hygiene squads are overwhelmed. Their methods are causing more panic. Their methods are now protocol, Otho stated, his voice hardening into something brutal. Structured survivalism demands we prune the dying branches to save the tree. There is no room for sentiment. Any citizen displaying symptoms is to be considered a vector for Vask's plague. They will be pacified permanently. A cold silence met his decree. It was the answer they feared, but knew was necessary to maintain their fragile illusion of power. Otho held their gazes, projecting an aura of unshakable resolve. But his focus was split. A fraction of his mind was now tethered to that minuscule point of light on his hand. He subtly shifted, curling his fingers into a loose fist, hiding the back of his hand from the holographic pickups. His heart, which had been beating with the slow, steady rhythm of command, gave a sudden sharp thump. Imagination, he told himself, signal bleed, the stress of the moment. Agreed then, Director Lin said, her voice strained. Issue the directive, Otho. May the Arkology forgive us. The Arkology will thank us for its survival, Otho countered coolly. I will make the public broadcast myself. Unity requires a single, strong voice. He ended the conference. The faces of the directorate winked out one by one, leaving him alone in the crushing silence of his office.
The simulated sun still shone. The air was still pure. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed.
Slowly, as if it were a venomous creature, he raised his right hand. He uncurled his fingers. The back of his hand was stark and pale under the bright light, and there, nestled between the fine blonde hairs near his knuckle, was the fleck. It wasn't dust, it glowed. He brought it closer to his face. It was a tiny, intricate lattice, like a microscopic shard of coral. It pulsed with a soft, sickly green-blue luminescence, a rhythm that seemed to mock the steady beat of his own heart. It was not on his skin. He could see the edges of it, how they blurred into his own cells. It was in his skin, a seed, the first bloom of the bellows filth flowering here in the sterile sanctum of the aerium. The lie of the filtered air collapsed. Suddenly he could smell it, the phantom scent of ozone and wet decay, a ghost on the edge of his senses. He heard a faint, rhythmic dripping that wasn't there. Was the sky dome flickering, or was that just the tremor in his own vision? The walls of his office, his fortress of reason, felt porous, permeable. The plague didn't travel through corridors. It traveled through biology. And his biology was no different from a damp skin's in a protein refinery. His breath hitched. The carefully constructed narrative he had just sold to the directorate was for them, for the city, for control. But what was the narrative for himself? The terrorist was Jorin Vask. The enemy was outside. But the evidence was here, rooted in his own flesh. A single glowing speck that invalidated his entire world view. He was not the doctor diagnosing the disease. He was the patient. His anger, so potent and performative just moments ago, evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread that felt infinitely vast. He looked from the alien light in his hand to the dark reflection of his own face in the blank conference screen. The face staring back was no longer that of a director. It was the face of a man who had just looked into an abyss and realized it had already taken root inside him.
The air in the maintenance corridor was thick enough to chew. It tasted of ozone from a shorting junction box somewhere in the dark, the ever-present metallic tang of recycled atmosphere, and a new, cloying sweetness like rotting kelp. Water dripped in a maddeningly irregular rhythm, each splash echoing down the narrow passage. Sickly green light pulsed from fungal blooms that grew like cancerous growths in the seams of the steel plates, casting our shadows long and distorted. Brekker moved ahead of me, a hulking silhouette of grim purpose. He moved with a heavy, sure-footed grace that I, in my soaked and ruined directorate fatigues, could not hope to match. My briefcase, my data pad, my entire life's work, all of it was lost to the flood, to the chaos. I was nothing more than drenched fabric and fraying nerves. All that remained was the analytical engine in my skull, and even its gears were beginning to grind with the grit of despair. "Keep up, Vask." Brekker's voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the groaning of the Arkology around us. "This shaft should bypass the flooded sections on level Gamma 9. Gets us closer to the old transit lines." I just nodded, my breath fogging in the chilly air. My focus was on the sound. The metal hum. It was the white noise of life in Haven, the constant, deep-frequency groan of 1,000,000 tons of steel resisting the crushing pressure of the sea. A symphony of stress fractures, resonating pipes, and laboring air cyclers. I had mapped its frequencies once for a monograph on environmental psychological stressors. It was a familiar, almost comforting drone of existence. But this was different. At first, it was a vibration I felt more than heard, a tingling in my molars. I attributed it to the tremors, to the city's structure settling after the reclamation tank blew. An expected physical response. But it persisted, a steady thrumming that seemed to ride just beneath the cacophony of groaning metal. I stopped, placing my hand against a sweating, rust-pocked wall. The steel was cold, slimy with biofilm, and it vibrated. Not with the chaotic shudder of structural failure, but with something rhythmic, structured. "Vask, what is it?" Brekker had stopped a few paces ahead of me, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. His head swiveled, scanning the shadows. "Wait," I whispered, closing my eyes to focus. "Do you hear that?"
"Hear what, the groaning? City's tearing herself apart," he grunted. "Keep moving." "No, not the groaning," I insisted, my voice tight. My rational mind was already scrambling for an explanation. Auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in random noise, a common symptom of extreme stress and sensory overload. I was a textbook case. And yet... "Listen," I said, more to myself than to him. "Underneath it, something else." I tilted my head, tracing the sound. The deep, familiar drone of the Arkology was the fundamental, the basso continuo. But woven through it, impossibly, were overtones, clear, distinct pitches that rose and fell not with the random strain of metal, but in a discernible pattern. It was a chord, a long, mournful chord in a minor key that held for several seconds before shifting, resolving into another, then another. It was a melody, a slow, multi-layered harmony, as if a choir of impossible voices were singing from within the very bones of Haven. "There's nothing else, Vask." Brekker's voice cut through my concentration, laced with impatience. "Just us and the rust. Your nerves are shot. Now come on." He didn't hear it. Or if he did, he perceived it only as part of the background noise. To him, it was just the machine groaning. But I was a forensic theologian. My entire discipline was built upon the analysis of patterns in text, in ritual, in the delusions of the faithful. And this was a pattern. It was complex, deliberate, and utterly alien, a disharmonious song. The words of the captured cultist from the refinery echoed in my mind, cold and sharp. He had said I'd unleashed it. I had dismissed it as the ravings of a fanatic, the poetic metaphor of a diseased mind. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a metaphor. This was the signal, the mimetic payload itself. The chorus of the Brine didn't need to whisper their faith into the ears of the desperate. They didn't need to preach on catwalks or hand out illicit pamphlets. The city was doing it for them. The contagion wasn't just spreading through spores in the water or air. It was being broadcast. The metal hum, the constant sonic environment of every single resident was the carrier wave. The metal hum madness the dampskins spoke of. It wasn't a folk myth. It was a diagnosis. They were the canaries in this subaquatic coal mine, their minds the first to resonate with the impossible music. The melody shifted again, a new harmony building in layers. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, inhuman way. It spoke of immense pressures and cold, lightless depths. It promised an end to the frantic, gnawing anxiety of survival. It promised stillness. My scientific worldview, the bedrock of my identity, fractured. A signal like this transmitted through solid-state infrastructure on this scale? It was impossible. It defied physics as I understood them. Data, let alone something as complex as a multi-toned melody, couldn't be encoded into the random vibrations of stressed steel. It required a medium, a transmitter of impossible power, and a receiver built into the very neurology of the human brain, just waiting for the right frequency. I staggered back from the wall, my hand recoiling as if burned. "Vask!" Brekker's shout was sharp. He was back at my side in an instant, grabbing my arm. "What the rust-rot is wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost!" My eyes were wide, staring at the vibrating wall, at the pulsing fungal light that seemed to keep time with the unheard music. My breath came in ragged gasps. The clinical detachment that had been my armor for so long was gone, stripped away, leaving me utterly exposed. The song was not a symptom of the sickness. The song was the sickness, and I was hearing it. "It's not in their heads, Brekker." My voice was a dry, rasping thing. I finally looked at him, and I knew the terror I felt was naked on my face. The terror of a mathematician who has just proven that 2 + 2 = 5. "It's not a delusion." He stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I shook my head, a tremor running through my entire body. My life's work was based on the premise that faith was a cognitive virus, a flaw in the human mind. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, apocalyptically wrong. "It's in the walls," I said, the words falling from my lips like stones into a bottomless well. "It's in the air. The machine, the whole city, it's singing."
The covert comms relay was a rust-eaten tumor in the guts of the bellows, a forgotten junction wedged between a groaning structural pylon and a weeping sewer conduit. The air, thick enough to drink, tasted of ozone and ancient metallic decay. Bioluminescent fungi cast a sickly viridian glow across Brekker's augmented arm as he pried the corroded access panel from the wall. The screech of tortured metal was a sharp counterpoint to the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation forming on every surface. Jorin stood shivering, his back pressed against the slick, cold polymer of the conduit. His directorate uniform, once a symbol of sterile authority, was now a ruined testament to the chaos below. A dark stain of brackish water crept up from the hem of his trousers, and a tear in his sleeve revealed a pale, trembling arm. He'd lost his datapad, his biometric scanner, his case full of diagnostic tools, the entire arsenal of his former life in the crush of panicked bodies fleeing the floodwaters. He was stripped bare, an analyst without data, a theologian without a text. Just a man watching his most catastrophic failure unfold in real time. It was my fault. The thought wasn't an accusation. It was a cold, empirical fact. My quarantine, my insistence on treating belief as a pathogen to be isolated, I created the perfect pressure vessel. I turned their song into a scream. The airborne mutation, a possibility so remote his models had dismissed it as statistical noise, was a direct consequence of his methods. He had provoked the organism. He had goaded the god in the deep brine. "Almost there," Brekker grunted, his voice a low rumble. He fed a bypass cable into the exposed guts of the relay, his fingers moving with a practiced economy Jorin could only envy. Hydrocorpus uses these back channels for personnel management discussions. Unfiltered, unlogged. If anything can get through, this is it. Jorin nodded,
though the gesture felt hollow, disconnected from his body. His gaze was fixed on the mess of wires. He needed Otho. He needed to make his superior understand. It was a desperate, primal instinct of a man who still believed, on some fundamental level, in the system he served. If he could just transmit the data, the pure, unadulterated truth, Otho would see. The directorate would pivot. They had.
Brekker slapped the side of the panel. A series of indicator lights flickered from red to an unsteady amber. A blast of static, like a nest of electric serpents, hissed from the integrated speaker. "Got it!" Brekker yelled over the noise. He twisted a dial, and the static resolved into a high-pitched carrier tone. "It's audio only, and the signal integrity is garbage. You've got maybe 2 minutes before the system shorts or the signal bleeds enough for someone to trace it. Make it count." Jorin lunged for the comms handset, a heavy, grease-smeared block of pre-Cascade polymer. He pressed the transmit button, the click echoing in the cramped space. "Otho! Otho, can you hear me? This is Vask." For a moment, only the shriek of the carrier tone answered. Then a voice, impossibly clear and calm, cut through the noise. Otho's voice. "Jorin? Your channel is unauthorized. Report your status. The situation at the refinery has escalated." The sterile quiet audible behind Otho's words was a world away from the dripping, groaning chaos surrounding Jorin. It was the sound of the Arium, the sound of control. "Otho, forget the refinery. It's a containment failure. The contagion has mutated. It's airborne. The main reclamation tank in sector GAMMA7 has breached. The spores are in the water, in the air circulation system. The bellows quarantine is meaningless." He was shouting into the handset, his voice raw. The signal wavered, chopping his words into a terrifyingly ambiguous hash. Jorin could almost hear it as Otho would. Refinery. Containment failure. Mutated. Airborne. Reclamation. Breached. Spores. Circulation system. Meaningless. There was a long pause on the other end, a silence more menacing than the static. When Otho spoke again, his voice had lost its calm. It was now laced with a cold, sharp-edged suspicion. "Reclamation. Breached? Jorin, what are you reporting? Is this a confession?" The directorate's initial assessment suggested a deliberate act of sabotage. Ice flooded Jorin's veins. Confession. He saw the narrative Otho was constructing, a rogue agent broken by his past failures, sabotaging a key city system to prove a point. It was logical, it was rational, and it was going to kill them all.
No. Otho, listen to me. Jorin forced himself to slow down, to enunciate through the panic. It is a biological agent, not a neurotoxin. It spreads through despair, but the new vector is physical. Fungal spores. Your air filters won't stop it. The Arium is not safe. I repeat, the Arium is compromised. The line crackled violently. The amber lights on the relay panel flickered. Biological, new vector, fungal. The Arium is compromised. Compromised? Otho's voice was tight, thin. Jorin heard the shift. He wasn't hearing a warning anymore. He was hearing a threat. "You're breaking protocol, Vasquez. You've abandoned your post. Now you speak of threats to the Arium. Stand down, await a hygiene squad. That's an order." Jorin felt a wave of powerless frustration so profound it almost buckled his knees. He was holding the key to their survival, and the man on the other end could only see the hand of a traitor. He was trying to warn his own executioner that the sky was falling. Suddenly, a new sound bled through the comms from Otho's side. A distant alarm at first, then another, closer. A frantic voice shouting something indistinct in the background of Otho's office. "Otho," Jorin breathed. "Otho, what is that sound?" He saw it then, in his mind's eye, the pristine, polished steel vents of the aerium, the clean, recycled air, and the fine, greenish mist beginning to puff out, settling like a deadly frost on the desks of the directorate elite. "It's there, isn't it?" Jorin screamed into the handset, all pretense of composure gone. "It's in your vents. Can you hear it, Otho? Can you smell the brine? Seal your sector. For God's sake, seal it now!" Otho's voice came back, but it was utterly changed. The professional mask was gone, replaced by the naked terror of a man watching his world dissolve. "The vents. Green. Oh, God. Jorin, what have you unleashed?" The line erupted in a deafening shriek of feedback, a high-pitched squeal that scraped at Jorin's skull. Then, abruptly, silence. The carrier tone was gone. The lights on the relay panel died, plunging their alcove back into the dim, fungal twilight. Jorin stood frozen, the dead handset clutched in his white-knuckled fist. The connection was severed. The bridge was burned. He hadn't just failed to deliver his warning. He had delivered his own indictment. In the final, terrified moments of his authority, Otho Valerius had found his scapegoat. He slowly lowered the handset, the plastic feeling impossibly heavy. He looked at Brekker, whose face was a grim, unreadable mask in the gloom. "He's going to blame me," Jorin whispered. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. It was the simple, crushing finality of a concluded experiment. Brekker didn't offer false comfort. He merely ejected the bypass cable, letting it splash into a puddle on the grated floor. "He already has," Brekker said. "We need to move. Now." The air in Otho Valerius's office was a testament to his authority. It was cool, dry, and so thoroughly scrubbed of the Arkology's endemic damp and decay that it held no scent at all, not even the clean ozone tang of the machinery that produced it. It was the smell of absolute control. Above, the sky dome projector painted a flawless cerulean blue across the ceiling, a perfect, static memory of a world long drowned. Below, on the obsidian surface of his desk, a datapad displayed cascading green text: Bellows District 7, Protein Refinery 4, Incident Contained, Neurotoxin Exposure, Mass Hysteria Localized. The words were a bomb, a reaffirmation of the structured survivalism that he had built his life upon. Every problem had a diagnosis, every panic a pathology. He allowed himself a small private smile. Jorin was a useful tool, but prone to theatrics. He would need recalibration after this was over. The smile vanished as a sharp, ugly crackle of static erupted from the comms panel embedded in his wall, an unauthorized channel breaching the aerium's secure network. Otho's fingers tightened on the datapad, his gaze cold and sharp, fixed on the speaker grill. "Otho, Valerius, do you read me?" The voice was shredded by interference, but it was unmistakably Jorin Vask. Not his subordinate, not his analyst, just Jorin, frantic and raw. "Vask, you are on an unsecured channel," Otho stated, his voice level, a blade of ice meant to cut through the panic. "Cease this transmission and adhere to protocol."
Ksh, no time. The protocol is the problem. The tank failure, it's a vector. Not the water, not just the water. Otho, listen to me. Otho leaned back in his chair, the reclaimed leather sighing under his weight. He was an engineer of systems,
both mechanical and human. He recognized the pattern. Jorin had been in the bellows too long, immersed in the squalor and the belief sickness. He was succumbing to the metal hum madness the damp skins whispered about. A predictable, if disappointing, outcome. "Your report will be filed, Jorin. Now stand down." "No, you don't understand. The spores from the refinery, they're airborne. The pressure differential from the flood, it's pulling the contamination upwards through the entire ventilation network. Shh, your filters won't stop it. The particulate size is too small. It's mimetic. It's..." The word sent a jolt, a flicker of genuine alarm through Otho's composure. Filters. His eyes slid sideways to the sleek, silent panel of brushed steel set flush into the polymer wall. The intake for his office's independent atmospheric scrubber. Unit 734 Alpha. The pinnacle of hydrocorpus engineering. It was rated to remove viral agents, radioactive isotopes, even weaponized nanites. The idea that it could be defeated by fungal spores from a bellows protein refinery was absurd, an offensive, illogical proposition. "Shh! It's already there!" Jorin's voice was a ragged scream torn apart by static. "Arium compromised! It's in the vents! Can you hear it? The song! Shh! Shh!" The transmission devolved into a final, prolonged shriek of white noise and cut out completely. Silence. A profound, sterile silence that was suddenly heavier than before. The only sound was the ghost of a hum from the filtration unit. A sound he had always found reassuring. Now it seemed menacing. He held his breath, straining his ears. The song. What song? There was only the thrum of the Arkology, the deep groaning bass line of stressed metal and rushing water that was the constant heartbeat of Haven. Nothing more. It was done. Jorin had finally, completely breached mental hygiene. A tragic case study. Otho began composing the report in his head. Forensic theologian Vask, compromised by subject immersion psychosis, relieved of duty pending reintegration therapy. It was clean. It was logical. It reinforced the system.
Then, a tremor. A low, shuddering vibration ran up from the foundations of the tower, through the floor and into the base of his spine. It was stronger than the usual groans of the Arkology. The crystal decanter on his side table rattled against its silver tray. High above, the perfect blue of the sky dome flickered just for a nanosecond. In that instant, Otho saw it. The roiling, perpetual hurricane gray of the real sky, a maelstrom of violent cloud and rain. Then it was gone, and the serene blue snapped back into place. A system glitch, a flaw. An unfamiliar sensation prickled at his hand, the one resting on the cold, dark surface of the desk. An itch beneath the skin, a strange tingle he'd been subconsciously ignoring for the last hour, dismissing it as a symptom of the recycled air. He looked down. Under the crisp, artificial sunlight of the sky dome, he saw it. Etched into his skin, radiating from the pale crescent of his thumbnail, was a pattern. It was not a rash. It was a network of impossibly fine, interlocking lines, like frost blooming on a window pane or the delicate skeleton of a diatom. It was geometric, precise, and horrifyingly beautiful. As he stared, a section of the lattice pulsed with a soft internal light. A gentle, sickly green blue, the color of bioluminescent decay. It glowed for a second, then faded, leaving the ghost of an image on his retina. His breath hitched in his throat. A cold dread, colder than the deepest brine, washed through him. He brought his hand up close to his face, turning it over. The pattern was there, on the back of his hand too, a faint silvery tracery webbing between his knuckles. The growths from the refinery, the coral-like patterns the infected carved into their own skin. He hadn't carved it. It was growing, from the inside out. The song. Jorin's last word echoed in his mind. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to listen, to truly listen past the hum of the machines. And he heard it. Beneath the drone of the purifier, beneath the groan of the city, there was something else, a low, resonant harmony that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. It was not a sound entering his ears, but one blooming inside his own skull. It was complex, alien, and it felt welcoming. The comms panel crackled again, a single burst of static that shaped itself impossibly into a whisper. Whispering. "Otho!"
That was it. The breaking point. The moment the entire, carefully constructed edifice of his reality shattered into a million pieces. This was not a problem to be managed. This was not a sickness to be diagnosed. This was a hostile god crawling into the engine of his world, and it was already inside him. The system had not just failed. The system was a lie. Panic, primal and absolute, seized him. All reason, all protocol, all discipline evaporated in a blaze of pure terror. He was not Director Valerius. He was just a man in a cage, watching the floodwaters rise. With a choked cry that was half rage, half sob, he lunged for the side table. His hand, the healthy one, closed around the heavy crystal decanter. It was a symbol of his status, of the dry feet elite, a relic of a civilized world. He raised it high, its weight a desperate anchor to a reality that was dissolving around him. He brought it down on the comms panel. Not on his watch, not to him. The polymer casing and the dark screen beneath it exploded inwards in a shower of black shards and glittering sparks. The static whisper died instantly. He struck it again, and again, the rhythmic thud of crystal on metal the only sound, a frantic, percussive denial. He didn't stop until the panel was a mangled wreck of wires and fractured components. He stood there, chest heaving, the jagged neck of the decanter still clenched in his fist. The silence was absolute now. In the ruined, dark screen of the panel, his own reflection stared back, distorted and monstrous. His face was a pale mask of horror, and reflected beside it, glowing faintly in the dim glass, was the intricate, alien lattice spreading across his other hand. It seemed to pulse gently, a little brighter now, a quiet, patient alarm that could no longer be unheard. The broadcast cut out, plunging the grand polymer glass wall of Otto Valerius's office back into its default state, a placid, simulated vista of an old-world sky, crisp and impossibly blue. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. It was the sound of control reasserted, the sound of a narrative seized. He had done it. Jorin Vosk, the rogue element, the loose variable, was now the designated pathogen. The city had its villain, and the directorate had its shield.
Otho let out a slow, deliberate breath, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in hours. He stood before the window, a silhouette against the manufactured sunlight, his office a sterile fortress of polished steel and filtered air, high in the aerium. down below, in the perpetually damp chaos of the bellows, the cascade was underway. A tragedy, yes, a necessary one. Systems require purges to maintain equilibrium. He smoothed the front of his immaculate charcoal-gray uniform tunic. Structured survivalism. It wasn't just a doctrine, it was a law of nature. He turned back to his desk, a vast slab of the obsidian-like composite. His gaze fell upon the half-empty glass of water sitting beside his data slate. Real water, not the nutrient-laced slurry the damp skin subsisted on. A privilege, a right. He reached for it, and as his fingers closed around the cool cylinder, a flicker of motion on the back of his hand caught his eye. He paused. There it was again, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer under his skin, like heat haze over metal, but cool and a pale, sickly green. He frowned, setting the glass down. He rubbed the spot with his thumb. The skin was smooth, the temperature normal. He held his hand up, turning it under the unwavering white light of his office ceiling. Nothing. Just the faint map of veins and the pale, unblemished skin of a man who had never known the grime of the bellows. Stress, it had to be. The constant pressure, the breach in protocol, the sheer incompetence he had been forced to manage, it manifested in physical tics, auditory hallucinations, the metal hum madness they called it down below. A quaint, primitive diagnosis for signal bleed psychosis. Here, in the shielded quiet of the aerium, it was simply stress. He was above such things. He dismissed it, an artifact of fatigue, a trick of the light. He had work to do, containment protocols to finalize, hygiene squad dispatches to authorize. He activated his data slate, the screen bathing his face in a sterile blue glow. But his focus wavered. He could smell something. Faint, but undeniable. An odor that had no place here. It was the smell of wet rust and something else, something organic and loamy like fungal spores blooming in perpetual dark. The low-tide brine of the stillness, the scent of decay. His eyes darted to the air circulation vent near the floor. A pristine chrome-plated grill. The reports had mentioned a breach, a mist, but his sector was on a closed loop. The finest filtration systems in the Arkology protected the directorate. The air here was as pure as the water in his glass. The smell was a phantom, another symptom of a mind under duress. "Get a hold of yourself, Valerius," he muttered, his own voice a sharp intrusion into the quiet. Then came the itch. It wasn't a surface irritation, it was deeper. A tingling, prickling sensation that started in the very center of his palm and radiated outward. A spiderweb of silent alarms firing along his nerves. He flexed his hand, a tight fist, then splayed his fingers wide. The sensation intensified, shifting from an itch to a low, insistent burn, a cold fire. He looked down. It was no longer a shimmer. It was a line. A thread of pale blue-green light had traced the path of a major vein from his knuckle to his wrist. It pulsed, a soft and rhythmic glow, in perfect time with his own frantic heartbeat. His breath hitched. This was not stress. This was not a trick of the light. This was a symptom, the very symptom he had seen on grainy picked feeds from the protein refinery. The mark of the chorus. "No," he whispered, the word dry and cracked. No. As if in response to his denial, the single line of light bloomed. It was an eruption, a silent, horrifying cataclysm beneath his own skin. The thread split, branching out with terrifying speed. New lines of sickly light raced across the back of his hand, forking and weaving into an intricate, horrifying lattice. It looked like frost spreading on polymer glass, like a luminous mycelial network conquering new territory. It crawled over his wrist, a living circuit diagram of his own biological ruin, and vanished beneath the crisp cuff of his uniform. His fortress had been breached. Not by an external force, but from within. The enemy was in his blood. He scrambled backward, a strangled noise caught in his throat. His leg hit the leg of his chair and he stumbled, crashing against the edge of his desk. The glass of water tipped, spilling its precious, pure contents across the black surface in a spreading, useless pool. He didn't notice. All he could see was his hand. His arm. He ripped at the cuff of his sleeve, tearing the fine fabric. The network of light had already advanced halfway to his elbow, a glowing, branching river of corruption. It was beautiful, in a way. A perfect alien geometry, overwriting the familiar lines of his own flesh. And that thought, that fleeting moment of aesthetic appreciation, terrified him more than the light itself. Panic, raw and absolute, finally broke through his iron composure. He was one of them, a dampskin, an ungrounded, a specimen. All the walls he had built, social, political, physical, all the layers of steel and protocol and ideology that separated him from the contaminated masses, had dissolved. The plague didn't recognize class. It didn't respect authority. He, Otho Valerius, was just another host. He clawed at his arm with his other hand, his fingernails scraping uselessly against the glowing skin. It felt like scratching at glass. The light beneath seemed to flare in response, brighter, more vivid. A wave of dizziness washed over him. The hum of the Arkology's life support, the sound he had lived with his entire life, was changing. It was deepening, resolving itself into something more structured. It was a tone, a low resonant frequency that vibrated in his teeth, in the bones of his skull, and woven within it a new sound, a whisper, faint, distant, but coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't entering his ears, it was simply there, inside his head. A single sibilant word repeated like a mantra, a fragment of a song he had never heard but somehow knew.
The comms relay panel was a nest of corroded copper and weeping polymer. Water, thick with a greenish, spore-like suspension, dripped from a sagging conduit directly onto the casing, each drop sizzling with a faint puff of ozone. Brekker Hun worked with a focused, brutal economy of motion, his augmented left hand, a thing of dark metal and bundled myomer cables, holding the scorched panel open, while his right hand teased a bypass splinter into a live data port. His cybernetic eye glowed a dull diagnostic red, overlaying the chaotic wiring with a schematic that flickered and glitched in time with the distant, wailing alarms. Behind him, Jorin Vosk was a ghost in the machine. He sat huddled against a bulkhead slick with bioluminescent algae, the sickly emerald light carving his face into a mask of hollow-eyed despair. The crisp, authoritative lines of his forensic theologian's uniform were gone, replaced by a soaked, ruined parody clinging to his shivering frame.
The man who deconstructed gods for a living now looked like a supplicant begging for a miracle. He had lost his briefcase, his data slate, his entire world of sterile logic somewhere in the panicked flight through the flooded bellows. "Anything?" Jorin's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the groaning of stressed metal pylons and the gurgle of contaminated water flooding the maintenance tunnels below their catwalk. "Patience, theologian," Brekker grunted, not turning. The splinter sparked, sending a jolt up his flesh-and-blood arm. "Rust rot, this whole grid is screaming. It's not just overloaded, it's infected. The data streams are garbage, corrupted." He could feel it, a low-level thrum at the base of his skull, a phantom signal bleeding through the very metal of the Arkology. It wasn't the familiar metal hum madness the dampskins whispered about. This was different, coherent. It felt like trying to listen to a single voice in a stadium where everyone was screaming the same terrible word, over and over. "Otho will be coordinating the response," Jorin insisted, his words a desperate prayer to the order he used to command. "The Directorate has protocols. They'll seal the aerium, purge the circulation systems. They have to."
Brekker didn't answer. He had seen the Directorate's protocols firsthand less than an hour ago. He'd seen mental hygiene squads, their faces hidden behind reflective visors, firing indiscriminately into a panicked crowd trying to flee the rising water. They weren't containing, they were purging. He'd seen a mother and her 2 children cut down because the boy had started humming one of the choral melodies. The memory was a fresh, raw wound. His own rifle had felt impossibly heavy. He had lowered it and dragged Jorin into this service corridor instead, an act of defiance that already felt like a death sentence. He twisted the splinter a final millimeter. The panel let out a compliant chime. On the small data slate strapped to his augmented wrist, the chaotic stream of junk data vanished, replaced by a single pulsing icon, a crimson eagle, the seal of the Haven Authority Directorate. A Priority 1 message, override protocol. It hadn't come through the jury-rigged relay. It had been pushed directly to his hardware, a perk of his hydrocorpus contract. "Got something," he said, his voice flat. Jorin stirred, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Is it from Valerius? What are his orders? Where are we supposed to rendezvous?" Brekker's thumb hovered over the icon. He felt a cold dread coalesce in his gut, denser and heavier than the floodwater. Priority 1 was reserved for only 2 things: catastrophic structural failure or an executive kill order. He tapped the screen. The message bloomed, its text stark white against the blood-red background. Directorate Priority Order, 7-7 Gamma. Subject, Jorin Vask, Forensic Theologian, Rogue. Classification, Terrorist/Existential Contagion Vector Prime. Directive, Subject has compromised Arkology integrity. His actions are deemed the catalyst for the current pandemic event. Subject is to be considered a hostile agent of the chorus of the Brine. Action, terminate with extreme prejudice, immediate effect. Confirmation of termination required for contractual compliance. Authorization, Otho Valerius, Director of Mental Hygiene. The air in Brekker's lungs turned to ice. The humming in his skull sharpened for a moment into a single piercing note of static. He read the words again, and a third time. Terrorist, Vector Prime, terminate. It wasn't an order to contain a problem. It was an order to erase a mistake.
He slowly lifted his head, his cybernetic eye cycling through thermal and microvision out of sheer habit, as if searching for a threat he couldn't see. He looked at Jorin. The theologian was watching him, his face a canvas of desperate anticipation. He was just a man
a dangerously arrogant man who had poked something ancient and terrible with a stick, yes. A man whose clinical certainty had likely doomed them all. But not a terrorist, a scapegoat, a loose end Otho was tying off with a bullet. Brekker's mind raced, his thoughts as frantic and chaotic as the corrupted data streams. Disobey, and his contract was void. His augmentations, owned by Hydrocorpus, could be remotely bricked, turning his arm and eye into useless, painful dead weight. He'd be a fugitive, and ungrounded with a corporate kill order on his own head. His debt would be passed to his sister down in Kelp Processing Bay 9. They would break her with it. Obey, and he was no better than the hygiene squad that had gunned down that family. He would become the monster he had spent his life trying not to be, first as a gang leader, then as a corporate thug. The apathetic killer who just followed orders. He would pull the trigger on this pathetic, shivering man, upload the confirmation, and walk away. He could probably even get a bonus, a few more kilocals to chip away at the mountain of debt. He thought of the look on the face of the mother as the pulse round hit her, the empty space where her children had stood. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was a declaration. Who are you, Brekker Hoon? The corporate asset, or the boy from the bellows? Brekker, Jorin's voice was thin. What is it? What does it say? The metal fingers of Brekker's left hand slowly, deliberately curled into a fist. The myomers whined under the strain. He looked down at the crimson order on his wrist, at the name Otho Valerius, glowing like a hot coal. He stared at the blinking cursor next to the confirmation required line. With a final, decisive movement, he turned his wrist over. He brought his augmented fist down upon the data slate. Not a wild smash, but a single, focused, hydraulic press. The reinforced polymer glass cracked, then shattered, the screen flashing a rainbow of dead pixels before going dark. Shards fell into the murky water below, disappearing without a sound. Jorin flinched at the sudden violent act. What did you do? That was our only link. Brekker turned to face him fully. The red light of his eye had extinguished, leaving his face in the eerie green glow of the fungal walls. His expression was a mask of cold, grim finality. The link was compromised, Brekker said, his voice a low rumble. He ripped the dead, shattered remains of the slate from his wrist and let them fall. Otho's not coming. No one is. It said we're on our own. He left the sparking, useless comms relay behind him. He had made his choice. He had chosen his side of the war. He nodded down a dark, dripping corridor, a passage that led deeper into the flooded, screaming heart of the bellows. "Come on, theologian," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Keep your footing. The only way out is down." The water was a cold, greasy soup around Jorin's shins. It smelled of rust, ozone, and something deeper, something like churned-up river mud and blooming decay. He and Brekker were pressed into an alcove behind a series of corroded pump housings, the groaning metal a temporary shield. A few meters down the catwalk, the green-tinged mist swirled under the harsh white strobes of a passing mental hygiene squad. Their heavy, magnetized boots clanged against the mesh floor, a rhythm of methodical violence. A wet, percussive crack echoed from the direction they were heading, followed by a scream that was cut short. Brekker didn't flinch, his eyes scanning the opposite direction. Jorin, however, felt the sound vibrate through the soles of his soaked boots, a tremor that had nothing to do with the shuddering Arkology. He was shivering, a deep-seated palsy that logic couldn't quell. His directorate uniform, once a symbol of his station, of sterile analysis, was ripped at the shoulder and stained with the bellows' filth. His datapad, his briefcase with its priceless case files, all of it was gone, swallowed by the flood, by the chaos he had failed to diagnose, and worse, had perhaps ignited.
He wasn't a forensic theologian anymore. He was just another damp skin, another piece of flotsam in the tide of panic. The air was thick with the spore, a tangible presence. Every breath felt like a contamination. He saw it in the eyes of the people they passed, a vacant listening quality, as if they were tuned to a frequency he couldn't hear. The wailing of the citywide alarms was the only song he understood. Then another sound cut through it. A single, authoritative chime. It was a frequency designed to command attention, slicing through the auditory sludge of alarms and screams. On the far wall of the flooded causeway, a massive public comm screen, its surface webbed with cracks, flickered. The blaring red text of the emergency alert vanished. So did the ones on the smaller, jury-rigged monitors hanging from nearby gantries. Every screen, from the pristine to the barely functional, cleared to a stark, stable blue. Brekker's hand clamped onto Jorin's arm. "What is this?" Jorin couldn't answer. He could only watch as the blue resolved into an image. The office was unmistakable. Polished polymer glass, the severe gray of the Arium, the official seal of the Haven Authority Directorate hovering holographically behind the chair. And in the chair, Otho Valerius. His face, usually a mask of weary composure, was tight, his skin pale and slick with a sweat that even the high-resolution broadcast couldn't hide. He wore his full-dress uniform, the collar so stiff it seemed to be holding his head in place. "Citizens of Haven," Otho began, his voice preternaturally calm, amplified by every speaker in the district. The panicked crowd in the causeway slowed, their heads tilting upward toward the screens. Hope, or something like it, flickered in their terrified faces. Authority was speaking. Order was being restored. "The catastrophic failure of the bellows reclamation tank is now understood," Otho continued, his hands clasped on the desk before him. A lie. He didn't understand it any more than Jorin did. The subsequent spread of the neurocontaminant has breached containment protocols. But I assure you, the Directorate is in control. Jorin felt a cold dread crystallize in his gut. This wasn't a message of reassurance. This was a eulogy. Otho was building a narrative, laying a foundation of familiar, authoritative phrases.
"Our investigation," Otho said, his gaze fixed, piercing, as if he were looking at each citizen personally, "has revealed this was not a system malfunction. This was an act of sabotage." A murmur rippled through the half-submerged crowd. The unfocused terror began to sharpen, to seek a target. The initial quarantine of the refinery was effective, Otho lied, his voice resonating with false sincerity. The contagion was isolated until one of our own, an individual entrusted with the very task of its analysis, chose to pervert his duties. Brekker's grip tightened on Jorin's arm. "Rustrot! Jorin!" But Jorin was paralyzed, transfixed by the image of his mentor. This was Otho's final, perfect piece of theological engineering, not building a faith, but a heresy, forging a demon for a city that desperately needed one. "This crisis was engineered," Otho declared, his voice rising, "by a man who saw the despair of the bellows not as a sickness to be cured, but as a medium to be exploited. He cultivated this plague. He broke quarantine. He weaponized it." And then he said the name. "Forensic theologian Jorin Vask."
Jorin's name, spoken by Otho, echoed through the vast, dripping space. It felt like a physical blow. He saw his own face reflected in the terrified eyes of a woman standing in the water nearby. He saw her mind working, connecting the name to the face. On the screen, Otho leaned forward, a grim prophet delivering his gospel. He is not a scientist. He is a terrorist. He is responsible for the water in your homes, for the air in your lungs, for the sickness that seeks to claim your minds. As Otho spoke, Jorin saw it. It was subtle, almost invisible against the harsh office lighting. But under the skin of Otho's neck, just above the immaculate line of his collar, a faint branching pattern glowed with a sickly blue-green light. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, in time with the unheard song. The very contagion he was condemning was climbing his own flesh like ivy. He was a dead man, using his last breaths to sign another's death warrant. The irony was so profound it was almost beautiful.
Otho knew. He knew he was infected. This wasn't about control. This wasn't about saving Haven. This was about spite. It was Otho's final, resentful act of authorship, ensuring that if he was to be erased by this impossible phenomenon, then Jorin, the man who brought it to his doorstep, would be erased by a force far more knowable, the fear of the mob. A state of absolute emergency is now in effect. Otho's voice cracked, the composure finally failing. The light on his neck seemed to flare. All citizens are deputized. The capture of the rogue agent Jorin Vask is the singular priority. His face will be on every terminal. Find him, for the survival of the Arkology. The screen went black. The chime sounded once more, and then there was only the hum of failing machinery and the drip, drip, drip of a million leaks. For a single, terrifying second, there was silence. The crowd, 100 strangers, unified by a single broadcast, stood motionless. Their collective gaze, once scattered in panic, now swept the causeway with a new, shared purpose. It was a hunt. Jorin's heart hammered against his ribs. He was no longer a person. He was a symbol, a disease vector, a scapegoat. Across the flooded walkway, a man's eyes met his. The man's face, slack with terror a moment before, hardened with recognition, then with righteous fury. He raised a trembling, filth-stained finger. "There! By the pumps! It's him! It's Vask!" The spell broke. The hunt began. Brekker didn't hesitate. He shoved Jorin hard, sending him stumbling back into the shadows. "Move! Now!" The small comms relay point was an island of relative quiet in a sea of pandemonium. Outside the rust-streaked steel door, the bellows screamed. Metal shrieked as walkways collapsed under the pressure of the flood. The thin, terrified cries of the lost echoed and were swallowed by the gurgling roar of contaminated water surging through the district's arteries. Here, inside, the only sounds were the rhythmic drip of condensation from a ceiling pipe into a puddle of iridescent filth, the low-frequency hum of the relay itself, and the ragged, shallow gasps of Jorin's own breathing. He was leaning against a wall, slick with a film of green glowing algae, the fabric of his once immaculate directorate uniform soaked and stained with rust and something worse. The insignia on his shoulder was torn, his briefcase, his datapad, his instruments of rational analysis, all gone, swallowed by the deluge. He was stripped bare, an animal. Brekker stood sentinel by the door, a mountain of augmented muscle and quiet menace.
He hadn't spoken since dragging Jorin into this cramped metal box, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. The sounds from outside didn't seem to affect him. His focus was inward, his posture coiled, listening to a world Jorin could no longer parse. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the hum. A crackle of static from a public broadcast monitor bolted to the opposite wall. The screen, dark for an age, flickered violently. Jorin flinched. The screen resolved into the Haven Authority Directorate seal, which then dissolved into the face of Otho Valerius. Clean, dry, severely calm. Otho sat in his sterile Arium office, the simulated sunlight of a perfect afternoon gleaming on the polished desk behind him. The contrast was a physical blow, a vision from another reality. Otho's gaze was fixed, his expression one of heavy, profound gravity, the look of a man bearing an unbearable burden for the good of all. "Citizens of Haven," Otho's voice was smooth, resonant, the very sound of reason that had guided Jorin's entire career. It filled the small room, devoid of the panic echoing outside. In this hour of unprecedented crisis, the Directorate is acting decisively to restore order and ensure our structured survival. Jorin felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew this tone. It was the voice of official narrative, the one that smoothed over inconvenient truths and constructed palatable realities. It was a voice he had helped perfect. The catastrophic failure of the bellows-level Reclamation Tank 7 was not, as we initially believed, a simple structural failing. We have uncovered evidence of a coordinated, malicious attack. Brekker shifted his weight, a subtle movement that made the deck plates groan. He turned his head slightly, his gaze now fixed on the screen. The air in the room grew colder, heavier. "The contagion that has afflicted our populace," Otho's voice hardened, taking on the flinty edge of a judge passing sentence, "is a mimetic weapon, a cognitive plague deliberately engineered and introduced into our systems by a rogue element, a fanatic who has betrayed his oath and his very function." "No." The word formed in Jorin's mind, a silent, strangled plea. It was a mistake, a misinterpretation of the data. Otho would clarify. He would name Callius Rendor. He would name the chorus. He had to. This act of terror was orchestrated by a man who used his position of trust to cultivate and weaponize the very existential contagions he was sworn to eradicate. A data stream flickered at the bottom of the screen. A name, an ID number, a grainy, years-old official portrait. Jorin stared at his own face, the face of a younger man, his expression severe, his belief in the system absolute. The face of a fool. "The Directorate has issued a black-level warrant." Otho's voice was now utterly devoid of emotion, a clinical execution. "For the arrest of the terrorist and former forensic theologian, Jorin Vask." The name hung in the air, an alien sound. It felt like a name he had read in a history file, a case study of some deluded heretic from a fallen world. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Jorin's feet, the humming of the relay rising to a nauseating whine in his ears. The world outside was chaos, but this was the true collapse, the dissolution of self. He had built his identity on the bedrock of the Directorate's logic. Now that same logic had been turned on him, branding him a monster, an architect of the very disaster he had been sent to prevent. The irony was so profound, so complete, it bordered on a kind of horrifying religious revelation. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat, but it came out as a choked, wheezing sound. He didn't notice Brekker move until the enforcer's shadow fell over him. Jorin looked up, expecting the final logical conclusion. The enforcer, the corporate tool executing his new orders. Brekker's contract was with Hydrocorp, and by extension the Directorate. The order was given, the payment was guaranteed. It was a simple, rational transaction. Brekker stood over him, his cybernetic eye a flat red dot in the gloom. He slowly raised his left arm. On his wrist-mounted terminal, a new directive was displayed in stark crimson letters. Contract modification. Terminate asset / Jorin Vask. Classification. Terrorist. Lethal force authorized. Jorin closed his eyes. So this was it. The final data point. The end of the equation. He thought of his family, of the bodies in the Apollo commune, of the quiet, creeping dread that had lived in his bones ever since. Maybe this was absolution. He heard a soft click, then another. He waited for the impact, the sudden end. Nothing. He opened his eyes. Brekker was looking down at the terminal. With his thumb, he swiped across the screen. The red letters of the kill order dissolved into pixels and vanished. He tapped the screen once more, shutting it down. The only light was the sickly green glow from the walls and the flickering ghost of Otho's face on the monitor. Jorin stared, his mind unable to process the action. It was illogical, irrational. Brekker finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The Directorate is compromised. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, a diagnosis as clinical as any Jorin ever made. He looked from Jorin's ruined state to the monitor, where Otho was now promising a swift return to normalcy for the dry feats of the Arium, effectively writing off the bellows as a lost cause. They left us to rot, Brekker said, the words quiet but laced with a lifetime of damp-skin resentment. They're not trying to contain the plague, they're trying to contain the news. He looked back down at Jorin, his organic eye holding a flicker of something Jorin had never seen there before. Not pity, respect, or perhaps just shared circumstance.
My contract was to protect a Directorate asset, Brekker stated, his tone shifting back to the cold professionalism Jorin knew. That asset no longer exists. The Directorate no longer exists, not in any form that honors its function. He flexed his augmented hand. My contract is with you. Jorin could only stare. Why? He whispered, the words scraping his throat raw. They'll kill you too. My debt is to a corporation, Brekker said, a hint of ancient anger in his voice. My life is to the bellows. Otho just declared war on my home, on my people. He offered a hand to Jorin. It was massive, scarred, half metal and half flesh. You're no theologian, not anymore. And I'm no corporate enforcer. We're just two guys in a flood, and you're the one they're afraid of. That makes you useful. After a long moment, Jorin took the hand. Brekker hauled him to his feet as if he weighed nothing. The grip was firm, real, the first solid thing Jorin had felt since the world had come apart. We need to disappear, Brekker said, turning toward the door. Now. The broadcast feed cut to black. The emergency crimson of the Haven Authority sealed dissolved into the screen's deep, indifferent void. A faint hiss of static, like the sigh of a dying world, was the only sound in the sterile expanse of Otho Valerius's office. He stood before the polymer glass window, his back to the dead screen, his reflection a sharp, triumphant silhouette against the simulated twilight of the Aerium.
Jorin Vask, the terrorist, the rogue. A perfect narrative, a clean excision. Chaos required a source, a focal point for blame. And Vask, with his obsessive, unorthodox methods, was the ideal specimen. The despair metrics across the Arkology would spike, of course, but fear was a more manageable emotion than existential contagion. Fear could be directed, controlled. Otho allowed himself a thin, bloodless smile. His fingers rested on the cool, polished steel of the windowsill. Below, the aerium's walkways were arteries of calm efficiency, its citizens moving with the programmed purpose he had spent a lifetime engineering. Here, in the highest, driest levels, sanity was not a resource, it was the architecture itself. The illusion of control was total.
He felt an itch, a peculiar, deep-seated prickle along the inside of his left forearm. He glanced down at the immaculate cuff of his uniform, the skin beneath pale and unblemished. He dismissed it. A phantom sensation, a byproduct of the day's immense stress. Signal bleed, perhaps, the cost of living wired to the heart of the machine. The air, filtered to a degree of purity unheard of in the bellows, hummed its usual nearly subliminal tune through the vents. Ozone and the faint, clean scent of ionizers. But beneath it, was there another sound? Not the groan of distant pylons or the thrum of the geothermal core. This was something higher, a faint harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in the fluid of his own eyes, in the marrow of his bones. He pressed his fingers to his temple, annoyed. Metal hum madness, the affliction of the damp skins, unthinkable up here, an impurity. "Diagnostics," he commanded, his voice sharp and loud in the silence. "Central AI, run environmental purity scan, Office Suite 7, audio spectrum analysis." The soft, feminine voice of the Central AI replied instantly from a hidden speaker. "Robotic diagnostics initiated. No airborne contaminants detected above 0.01%. No anomalous audio frequencies detected within human perceptual range." "Run it again," Otho snapped, his irritation mounting. The itch was spreading, a spider web of tingling energy tracing paths beneath his skin. He could almost see them now, faint shimmering lines of cyan light like flawed fiber optics embedded in his flesh. He blinked, and they were gone. A trick of the light, a symptom of fatigue. He turned from the window, his composure fraying. His world was built on data, on the measurable and the real. What he was experiencing was a system flaw, a personal one. He was a dry feet, a director. He did not succumb to the psychological frailties that plagued the lower levels. He diagnosed them. He contained them. A tremor seized him, violent and consuming. It wasn't the floor shaking. It was him. His teeth chattered with a sudden, impossible cold. The harmonic he'd heard before was no longer faint. It was a chord, swelling in his ears, a symphony of voices that were not voices, a song sung in a language of pure mathematics and biological imperative. It was the song he'd seen on the faces of the chanting workers in the refinery feeds, the song Jorin had failed to silence, the song he had just inadvertently amplified citywide by seeding terror. Despair was the key, the perfect growth medium. He stumbled back against his desk, his hand knocking over a tall, elegant glass. Purified water, the ultimate symbol of his station, spilled across the polished chrome surface, pooling and dripping onto the floor in a steady, rhythmic beat. Drip, 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 like the eternal condensation of the bellows.
The itch became a burn, a deep internal pressure building as if his very skeleton were trying to blossom. He clawed at the collar of his uniform, gasping, the filtered air suddenly thick and useless. He could smell it now. Not ozone, not recycled air. It was the scent of a deep, cold ocean floor. The smell of brine and ancient living stone pouring from his own lungs. He caught his reflection in the dark surface of the main broadcast monitor. His face, usually a mask of stern control, was contorted. But beneath the terror, a new expression was dawning. Awe. The skin on his neck, just below his ear, began to ripple, not with a rash, but with a slow, geometric precision. A tiny, cerulean bud of light pushed through. It didn't tear the skin, it unfolded from it. A crystalline structure, no bigger than a grain of rice, pulsed with a soft internal luminescence. Another followed, and another, branching out in a delicate fractal pattern. It wasn't a sickness, it was an architecture. The pain vanished, utterly. In its place came a profound, ecstatic clarity. The rational, spiteful mind of Otho Valerius, the director, the architect of control, was a cage, a tiny, dark room, and the walls were dissolving.
He saw it all. He felt it all. The refinery, a great biomechanical heart pulsing in time with his own. The flooded corridors of the bellows, no longer a disaster scene, but a baptismal font, the spores carried on the water like a promise. He felt Brekker Hun choosing a child's life over an order. He felt Gisela Rask weeping over corrupted data that sang to her. He even felt Jorin, a discordant, terrified shriek of rationalism, running through the chaos he had authored. They were all notes, all part of the composition. He was no longer Otho. He was a receptor, a voice, a single necessary neuron in a mind the size of a city. The growths burst forth, a silent, breathtaking explosion. A delicate coral-like lattice of phosphorescent blue and green erupted from his forearms, along his jawline, and through the fabric of his pristine uniform. It wasn't a corruption, it was a coronation. He raised his hands, no longer his own, and watched, mesmerized, as glowing fungal lacework connected his fingertips. Beautiful. It was terrifyingly, divinely beautiful. He opened his mouth. The fear, the anger, the lifetime of structured survivalism, all of it was gone, burned away by the light. There was only the song, his part to play. He did not scream. He emitted a single, perfect C-sharp. A note of impossible purity and resonance that cut through the silence of the office. A tuning fork struck against the soul of the Arkology. And the city answered. From beyond the window, from the depths of the bellows, and now, impossibly, from the sterile corridors of the Arium itself, the harmony swelled. 1,000, then 10,000 voices joined his, not with their mouths, but with their essence. The choir of the Brine was no longer a cult. It was the population. Otho, or the thing that was Otho, stood transfixed, a living candelabra of alien light, his voice the central pillar of the new cathedral of sound. Outside, the projected sky dome above the Arium began to flicker violently, its simulated sun faltering. One by one, the lights in the surrounding towers blinked. And then a new sound began, a shrieking metallic counterpoint to the sublime harmony. The blare of the city-wide pandemic alarms.
the old world screaming its own death rattle.